The cedar strip house sides are up and cut to size. This week, Steve will work on the interior side, fairing everything down in preparation for Arabella's first coat of paint. And Grant is on hand to help with that and some camera work as well. But then Steve and his grandpa find a tree problem that could be bad news for several pieces of farm equipment and the boathouse itself.
When it comes to the deck structure, like the house and the hatches when you get to them, there's the functionality of the boat to consider, and then there's the aesthetics of the boat to consider, because they will have quite a drastic impact on what the aesthetics of the boat look like. So when we're figuring out for the house sides, we're trying to walk that line between aesthetics and functionality. And one of the things that people do for aesthetics is you lean the house sides in a little bit, and that just makes it all flow and look a little bit nicer. You can create kind of an optical illusion sometimes with the rounded deck where vertical house sides will even almost look like they're leaning out a little bit. So you lean them in and everything looks a little bit nicer. But one of the downsides for that is if you're like us and you plan on putting in a significant number of port lights, when you install those port lights, this part is what goes out. And if you lean those house sides in, you start to create a pretty decent well here that whenever it rains or you have spray, that'll collect. And then on the inside of the boat, when you open the port light, you get this deluge of water, which is obviously less than ideal. So what we decided to do is we made the bottom of the house a little bit thicker. You can see we've got some overlap here, and we're gonna fair that in, and we're hoping that that'll give the house the illusion of leaning a little bit because the base will be fatter and it'll kind of taper up. But when we mount the port lights and install them, they're gonna sit vertically, and that way we don't have much of a well here to collect water. In the long run, I think that it's gonna bother me less having a 90-degree box stuck on top of the boat than every time it rains or there's spray to have to go out and mop them up or put something underneath them and open them and collect the water. I think that will bother me way more. But we'll see. Maybe the aesthetics will really nag at me, and someday I'll rip the house top off and rebuild it. And if that's the case, that's the case. It doesn't scare us at all. We did it once, we can do it again. But so far, I think we're on track. I think having the port lights that way and the vertical sides, I think will be fine. I think future Steve will be happy with that. Time will tell. Maybe future Steve will hate current Steve for this. We'll find out.
I like the sound effects.
Yeah, I can kind of
Helps the epoxy go in there.
narrate as we go along. Just Foley artist. Have to make sure there's no like huge divots or holes before we put the fairing compound on. So what we're doing is we're taking a really thick epoxy. You can kind of see it's pretty well thickened with silica. So we need to fill in all those holes before we put on the fairing compound. So we're just going along with a mixing stick and some epoxy. And then we're taking a putty knife and we're just running it along to smooth over any holes that we're filling up. And we have big knots like this, they just have to load it in there. And if we were using a thinner epoxy, it would just dribble out. But since this one is so thickened, you can really just glob it in there.
This is like a great consistency.
What?
So this was a great consistency.
Yeah. It's almost to the point where it's pulling itself out of cracks.
Yeah. But it's staying put really well.
Yeah.
And those bigger knots and divots, like you said, we'll just have to do a a second fill. This is the first fill anyways. The next one's the fairing compound.
Exactly.
So that'll take things even tighter.
So this is the silica thickener we were mentioning earlier, and we're just adding it a little bit at a time to the epoxy that we had pre-mixed, 2-to-1 ratio, to slowly thicken it. It's not setting the epoxy, it's just thickening it. You can see you don't want to breathe it in because it's really bad for your lungs, but it's great at thickening epoxy. So just mix it, and it takes a little while to be taken into the epoxy, but you can see as we go, we're getting thicker epoxy. It used to be like water, and now we're approaching maple syrup, and we really want to get to like a thick peanut butter state so that it'll hold in any holes we need to fill in the house sides. So you can see we need a lot more, but we want to add it slowly because it's easier to take, the epoxy takes it easier if you do it in small batches. So you can see we have it here, and then cover it up so the dust doesn't go everywhere, which is the stuff you don't want to breathe. That could be it. When we're holding it upside down, it's really slowly dripping off and just creating those big drips. It's not all falling off at once. There it goes. So we're pretty much at that peanut butter stage, which means we're ready to apply.
So according to the timestamp here, that took a bit over 7 minutes to go from no epoxy to thickened epoxy ready to go.
And it's a workout too. You're
stirring.
Easy.
It gets harder as you go, right?
Exactly.
It's thicker and thicker.
You're introducing more heat into it, which is going to speed up that process of solidifying that epoxy. And then as it starts to cure, it'll start to feel warmer. And here you can see, here we're really stuck because this is one of the containers that we had used earlier in one of the mixing sticks. And you can see that you can pick up the container, but there's nothing in there. We're just picking it up just by the cured epoxy in there, which is just shows how fast it cures. And this was probably half an hour to 45 minutes ago. So you don't have to work super fast, but you definitely want to be conscious of time when you're working with it.
Before Casey and I took the molds out, we traced where the port lights were because Alex and I had marked out about where we wanted those. And then I set some dividers to the radius of that circle and swung a couple arcs. And that gives the center. And then I drilled through so that we can find that even after all of these marks disappear. Because if we pan over just a little bit here, we can see this section in here I've already hit with the power plane. And our circle is disappearing, but we can still see the hole. And when we cut out the port lights, obviously that hole will disappear. If we want to move the port light, we still have a bit of wiggle room. And if we move it all together, we can just put a plug in that hole and it's not a big deal. I'm going to go through and sand some of this down, but I actually don't want to get rid of all of this roughness. We don't want to sand it totally perfectly smooth because the plan is to coat it all with some fairing compound, which is epoxy based, and it is going to love all these little nooks and crannies to hook onto, and then we'll smooth that out really nice and fair. And then after a couple layers of paint, that'll take care of any tiny little last imperfections. And we should be able to get all of this really nice and smooth without a ton of fuss or energy. Well, that's a little smoother. So that's what we're going for. You know, these divots here, that kind of thing, that'll get all filled in with the fairing compound. And as you can see, I've gotten almost all the way around with the sanding.
I've been using the Festool sander with the 6-inch and 40 grit, and it's just eating it off. That machine is so powerful, like it actually is hard to hang on to with the 40 grit in the Rotex mode. It grabs so hard. You really gotta hang on to that rig. But it does a phenomenal job. So we're just going to use some alcohol here and go wipe down everything that we are going to put the fairing compound on. And this is just to get rid of any of the dust that's left over so that we can get a good adhesion between the fairing compound and the cedar.
If you look back at the beginning, you can see that it's almost all evaporated already, but it looks cleaner. That sanding dust is no longer on there compared to the undenatured alcohol part.
Yeah, definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, you can see right in that corner there, you can see.
Yeah, this stuff looks all hazy and dusty, and that does not.
Exactly.
Yeah. Last time we used this stuff was on the ballast steel. I used it to help fair that out.
So how old does that make it?
A couple of years, 3 years.
Is it still going to be good to use?
Seems like it.
Great.
Don't see why not. So the first time we used it, it says to mix it 50-50, and we tried to use one of the like mixing tubs, and it's impossible to get it in there and get any sort of level. And then when we asked Jamestown about it, they said that should just make 2 piles of it and make them pretty much even and mix them up, and that doesn't matter hugely. It'll just kind of set a little faster, a little slower, depending on more resin or more hardener. So see how we're starting to go from like, I don't know, blue and what color would you call that? Yellow?
Peanut butter.
Orange, peanut butter. And I see how it's starting to turn green. That's what we want. So we want all of this to become one really nice uniform color.
Yeah, we want that homogeneous mix so some parts don't cure faster than others and some parts don't stay.
Potentially cure it all.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
that's what we're aiming for. Kind of a Statue of Liberty color. Coppery.
Alright, that's looking pretty good.
Great.
Hungry? Yeah, this is definitely bringing me back to drywall days. think that's good enough. Should be able to sand that out for the most part. And then by the time we put the epoxy primer coat on and a couple coats of the paint, I think that'll pretty much do it. We can always do one last little round of fairing if we got to. If we sand and find there's some stuff that's a little wonky.
While they waited for the fairing compound to dry, Grant and Steve took care of a few loose ends, like moving the planking benches out of the driveway. But a slightly larger task was looming over their heads as well.
We're back behind the boathouse, and we have a pretty big issue that we need to tend to very quickly. Otherwise, it could do a lot of damage. So if you look behind me, you'll see we have this pretty big maple tree, and part of that recently split. And that maple's providing the anchor point for the back of the boathouse to keep everything upright. And if that tree splits and goes on its own accord, there's a good chance that we're gonna crush a bunch of this equipment here, and we could do some real serious damage to the boathouse. That branches would be enough to tear through the black plastic, tear through the white plastic we have, possibly break the trusses. It would be really bad. So let's go closer and go take a look at that tree. So we've got a cable that runs from here up to that pole, another one that runs from the top of the pole to the other maple down there, and a third wire that goes from the top of the pole to a big stump that we buried in the ground. And that is what holds up the end of the boathouse here. So all of these three stays, they support that pole, and that supports the ridge line that helps keep the boathouse upright. So this is one of the low anchor points, and all we really need for this is a stump. So if we cut this tree off here, this will still support and stay there for the length of time that we need to finish the boat. But what's happened is this tree is split from here all the way down to here. And it grew that way, and this didn't used to be open. This used to be slammed shut. And up here, it's pulled out probably almost 2 inches. So in one of the windstorms, thunderstorms we've had this summer, the tops of these trees got moving enough that this has started to crack. So this tree is pretty weak. And if we get a really good windstorm again, there's a chance that this is gonna split in half. And depending on how it goes and depending on what way the wind's blowing, this very likely could end up smashing the side of the boathouse. The far leader could end up taking out the supports that hold up that pole. And we've got a whole bunch of Grandpa's equipment here that also might get smushed in the process. So we got to let this dry out today, but pull out the gear, get up this tree, and get the thing removed before it goes on its own and potentially causes a lot of damage. Grandpa's come down this morning with the tractor to help me move some equipment, and he's going to give us a quick tour of what he's got back here.
Well, Steve, as you know, this is a land rake, and it's what they call a 3-point hitch. And when we pick it up, obviously it comes off the ground, and we can travel where we want and put it down the right distance, and we can rake the ground. Works really good. These are my land plows. As most people see farmers plowing, they go one way down the road with their plows, and then they come around and they do it again. This set of plows, I can go one way, swap the plows up and down, and go back the other way. There's a plow on that side, throwing the dirt that way. There's a plow on this side, throwing the dirt this way.
How old is this plow?
Oh, Steve, this plow is probably as old as I am. I don't know. There's no way of telling, really. I suppose with today's internet, somebody might be able to look it up and say, I found it, but I have no idea.
So if you were going to, say, take this field over behind the tractor that's currently in fallow, all in grass, and were to get it ready to plant, which we do from time to time, what would your order of operations be?
Well, first of all, obviously, we would plow it, and the cutters on there would cut the turf, and the plows would turn it over, and that leaves you with rows. And then you would put this on, and run over your rows, and this would chop up any of the turf and smooth it out, and so that you're getting ready to plant.
Fantastic. And then behind you looks like a trailer.
Well, because I had so many llamas at one time, 21 of them, because we were taking folks hiking, we bought this old trailer in case we had to take a llama to the veterinarian, which we did several times. Right now, it's just sitting here and not quite sure what I'm going to do with it.
Cool. And then last but not least, I guess we got the old Massey Ferguson back there to move all this with, right?
Yeah, the Massey 50 is waiting to do some work.
And what year is that tractor?
That is a 58.
All right, that one's in. Gotcha. Okay, you're good. Okay. The fairing compound's cured overnight. I know it's quite hard, and I've been working on sanding it. So I've just got this little section left to do, and you can see the difference between sanded fairing compound and non-sanded fairing compound. Well, you can see where it's been sanded here with 80 grit. It's nice and smooth. Any imperfections are filled in. But we don't have a perfect glossy finish. We're not trying to get to 220 or anything like that. Because the next thing to go on here is going to be the primer coat, which is going to be an epoxy-based paint. That's TotalBoat's TotalProtect. And then when that's done, we'll actually put on the paint that you'll see that'll be the final coats. But right now, we just got to get it nice and fair. Just a little bit of sanding left to do. And then we can put on that epoxy primer. And that epoxy primer goes on pretty thick. So any of these tiny little divots that are left over, these are pretty shallow. And the epoxy paint should pretty much just fill those in. If it doesn't, we can just put a little more fairing compound on there, a little more epoxy paint, and should be good to go. If we wanted to be really fussy, we could go through and fill all these and give it one more sand. But I am not that fussy. Next on deck is TotalProtect. So this is the same stuff that Alex used on the mizzen mast. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about it, but it's just an epoxy-based primer. And we're just going to roll on one coat with this. Not going to be too fussy about it. And then when this is dried and hard, then we'll put on the final coats of the actual paint that we're going to end up using.
After the coat of primer dried, a few spots still stood out, so Steve applied a bit more of the fairing compound and then sanded that down.
Part of the reason I put the samples together when I did is that recently I had the very rare occurrence of myself and my other two siblings, I have two younger sisters, were all here at the same time, which hasn't happened actually in years. And one of my sisters studied interior design, and the other sister studied and works as a graphic artist. So when it comes to paint colors and fabric options and what's going to look good with what, I trust their judgment a lot more than I trust mine. So with the opportunity of having them come into town and be here, I wanted to make sure that I could make the most of that. So I put the samples together, and like I said before, we had the white ash, the sugar maple, the cherry, the oh so beautiful cherry burl, some black walnut, and of course Victoria's mahogany. So we looked at the white paints that Total Boat offers, and we got it narrowed down to a couple. I'm not quite committed to making a selection there yet, but we did make a choice for the house sides, and we chose to go with Total Boat Wet Edge, their Kingston Gray. And my sisters believed, and I agree with them, we'll see how it looks, that will go well with the bronze port lights, and it'll go well with like a white paint underneath the house top and underneath the deck. And they thought it would go really well with the maple and the cherry and the burl, and that was their vote. They thought the ash was a bit too yellow, which I can see. So I got to play with some finishes for the ash and maybe find one that gets that to come out a little more white and a little less yellow. But if not, we have plenty of cherry and maple to work with, not to mention the oak and locust, and those are beautiful. So now that the house sides they have their fairing compound, the epoxy paint, another quick round of fairing compound to hit the spots that we missed, and now they are ready for the actual paint. So I'm going to go through and give them a wipe down with denatured alcohol to get the residue off, just like we do with everything before painting. And I'm going to mix this up and apply it, and that'll be the first interior color of Arabella, which is pretty exciting to see come to fruition. I haven't tried these before. We bought them a while ago, but it always felt like the epoxy paint and stuff. Get out of there, Spidey. You ain't gonna like to go in there. Anyways, picked this up a little while ago and haven't put them to use yet. It should, in theory, allow mixing it really well, and then we should be able to just pour out what we want and then be able to just mix and pour and mix and pour. So this should be really handy when we're going to be doing a couple coats over a couple days, and then we'll have to clean all this out, but we'll see how it works. Well, seems good. Oh yeah, I like that.
definitely going to take a few coats.
The epoxy paint leaves a pretty rough surface. So this stuff is, I mean, I could try to brush it and tip it and get fancy, but I don't think we're gonna fill them without a couple coats. So we'll put this on and we'll give it a light scrub again and add another coat and a light scrub, and second, third coat, we'll start being a little more particular about brushing and tipping. But right now I'm just trying to make sure that we don't have any sags and get some color on there and kind of start to fill in that epoxy. And actually, with this being glossy, kind of having a little bit of texture to it might not be the worst thing in the world anyways. We'll see how it looks.
Next week, Steve will hoist himself up into the maple to take it down. And while we wait for Carolyn's imminent return, Steve will get back to work on the bulkheads as the work on Arabella's interior continues.
Get some of these wild grapes. Oh, look at that. Hey, Steve, come over here for a minute. Look at this. This is gonna go tremendous on my vanilla ice cream in a couple of nights. Look at those nice red berries, huh? Oh, that'll be delicious.
Yeah, those are just hiding under the wild grapes, huh?
Yes, they were. I don't know how many more, but we do have them.